Gaius Marius was born in 157 BC in a small town about 100 miles outside of the city of Rome named Ceratea. He was born into wealth as his family controlled large land estates. Despite this more than modest upbringing, he would be considered a plebeian throughout his political career. He would have grown up on one of these wealthy estates along with his younger brother, Marcus Marius. Not much is known of the early upbringing of these two boys, until Gaius Marius makes a life-changing decision to join the Roman military. In 134 BC, at the age of 23, Gaius Marius joins the legion of Scipio Aemilianus, a general made famous for the sack of Carthage in the Third Punic War. Marius quickly gains the recognition of Aemilianus, as he is quoted by Plutarch saying when somebody asked who might replace him in terms of his popularity among the Romans, he tapped Gaius Marius on the shoulder and said, "Perhaps this man." With Aemilianus, Gaius Marius and the legion were dispatched on a mission in modern-day Spain. More specifically, they were sent to the city of Numantia. Rome had been at war with the Celtiberians who controlled this city for the past 9 years. The mountains and other geographic features left this fortress near impenetrable. Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul in 134 BC specifically to siege and seize this fortress. After some pitched battles, which Marius would have seen combat for the first time in, Aemilianus besieged Numantia. This was no ordinary siege, as this city had no visible weaknesses or points to safely storm it. Scipio Aemilianus then uses a tactic that would go on to serve Julius Caesar at his later siege of Alesia. He would build a wall all the way around Numantia. This wall was 9 kilometers long around the city, with 2 towers guarding the river Douro. With the Celtiberians finding out that there was no escape, they surrendered, and were subsequently sold into slavery. Aemilianus had served the purpose of his consulship, and with him was Marius, who was shown how to win the people over with the use of the military. Marius continues to serve in the army, and by 123 BC, he was elected to the rank of military tribune, one of the 24 people of such rank in the 4 legions commanded by General Quintus Caecilius Metellus. Metellus, like his father before him, was elected consul. Upon election, he immediately prepares for and executes a campaign of the Balearic Islands, just off the coast of Spain. These islands were of course the home of the notorious Balearic slingers. Most on the island considered the sling as their way of life, as they expertly used the sling to protect the many sheep herds on the islands from predators. Despite this, by 121 BC, he had conquered all of the islands. For this he was granted a triumph, and the honorary title of Balearicus. Just a few months after the Balearic triumph, Gaius Marius is elected to the role of plebeian tribune, despite being from a wealthy equestrian family. The position of a plebeian tribune was something like a speaker is for the English House of Commons. During his 1 year as plebeian tribune, Marius managed to pass a law that granted a limitation to how many times a ballot of votes could be inspected. This was supposedly done to restrict the wealthy from corrupting the vote. This gained Marius respect with the plebeians, until a bill was presented to Marius. Being the tribune meant that he held the power to veto any bill from the consuls. The bill in question would allow for the expansion of the grain dole. Certain families each year were granted grain so that they could make bread with it, kind of like how the US government today hands out food stamps. Eventually, Marius would veto this bill, and when he did, he lost most of the respect that he had just earned from the plebeians. Despite this unpopularity, Marius continued to run for the office of the quaestorship. This election, he would lose. Most political careers in Rome would have ended right here, but not Marius. In 116 BC, a year after his failed campaign of 117, Marius ran for the office of praetor, and out of 6 possible praetor positions, Marius came in 6th place. Fraud and election corruption charges immediately came with this win. These were likely caused by his earlier ballot inspection laws that he made while being the tribune to the plebes. He was allowed to keep his newly won praetorship and very quietly sat in his new role. In 114 BC, Marius was supposed to lose his job, but instead, he got a promotion of sorts. His term as praetor was to be expanded, and Gaius Marius was sent to govern a rebellious province in Spain. The province of Hispania Ulterior had been experiencing problems with banditry, and it was the task of Marius to militarily eliminate this threat. He remained there for a whole year, gaining renown and wealth from the slaves and goods that he was able to capture in the conflict. By 113 BC, Marius was back in Rome, and wasted no time in finding a bride among the Roman elite. The patrician family that he married into was none other than the Julii family. This was, of course, the family that Julius Caesar would soon belong to. Gaius Marius and the aunt of Julius Caesar, Julia, would marry in 113 BC. In 112 BC, a new war had started. On one side was the ever-expanding Roman Republic, while the opposing side was Numidia. More specifically, this war was against King Jugurtha of Numidia. Among other charges, King Jugurtha had supposedly bribed senators in Rome, and even butchered a town of Romans in Africa. King Jugurtha was a master tactician, and was able to bribe one Roman army to leave, while he outright defeated another one. This war had no clear end in sight, as Jugurtha's Numidian cavalry seemed unstoppable and uncatchable. 3 years passed until 109 BC, when Marius decided to join the legion of that year's consul, Quintus Caecilius Metellus. Due to his former military experience, Marius was granted something of an advisory role by Metellus. During this 109 campaign, a battle would take place called the Battle of the Muthal River. Jugurtha led the Roman army into the formidable Nubian desert. The Romans had planned to refill their now increasingly emptying water canteens, but King Jugurtha stood, protecting the river. Being already too far to go back to the coast, a battle between the two armies was inevitable. The swift Numidian cavalry ran circles around the legions, and even ran through them. This, as well as the dust clouds being kicked up by the hooves of the horses, managed to split the Roman army into small groups. Roman infantry was near nothing without cohesion and discipline. At the brink of defeat, Gaius Marius supposedly steps up to supply that discipline. He starts to gather some of the lost and cut off men, to form around a 2,000-man unit that eventually finds their commander, Metellus. After reforming the remaining Romans, Marius and Metellus marched to the Numidian infantry, who were stationed on top of a hill. While the light armor of the Numidian cavalry gave them an advantage, as speed was perhaps their deadliest weapon, the light armor of the Numidian infantry put them at a huge disadvantage against the mostly heavily armored Roman soldiers. The Romans managed to defeat the infantry with relative ease, while being harassed by the Numidian cavalry. After capturing the hill, the army manages to catch some of the Numidian cavalry. The dehydrated Roman soldiers fought with them until the cavalry was better off withdrawing. The Romans had barely won. They had been lucky. Gaius Marius was a big reason that any Romans survived that battle. The campaign continued after this, but more slowly, as Metellus changed his strategy from direct combat to slowly taking houses and towns one by one. Metellus' consulship was about to run up, and the election of a new consul would become necessary. Despite Metellus' wishes, Gaius Marius ran for the consulship of 107 BC. He would win this consulship, the first of many, as he ran on a platform that rested on a quick victory against Jugurtha. Despite winning the consulship, Marius was not given command of Metellus' army, so Marius simply raised his own army and went back to Numidia with it. Marius was called a novus-homo, which meant that he was the first person in his family to be elected as consul. When Marius went back to Numidia, Metellus returned to Rome, where he received a triumph and the moniker Numidicus, even though he never defeated Jugurtha and he never conquered Numidia. Marius set about in his effort to capture Jugurtha, but quickly discovered why Metellus could never do it. Jugurtha was fast and seemed to hide in the wide open deserts. His scouts knew where all of the oases were among the desert, and this allowed his cavalry to run circuits around the infantry-based army of Marius. The cavalry part of Marius' army, which included Roman equites, who were usually Roman nobility that paid for all of their equipment and horses, was commanded by the 107 BC quaestor, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. There you are. I bet you were wondering when the two rivals would finally meet. The 31-year-old Sulla was now under the command of his future nemesis, the 50-year-old Gaius Marius. Lucius Cornelius Sulla was born in 138 BC to a patrician house that had fallen from a lot of their wealth, as some of his ancestors had committed theft. Despite this, Sulla managed to stay in modest housing for most of his early life. It has been said that Sulla was a patrician who was born as a plebeian, while Marius was a plebeian who was born with the wealth of a patrician, and it is for that reason that these two men came to blows with one another constantly. And this sense of not fitting into your class gave them both some kind of chip on their shoulder. Sulla grew up and eventually became notorious for his partying and drinking. Despite this, Sulla was reported to be well-read and intelligent, so he used his social skills and both of his heads to earn him some money. He gains the attention of a wealthy widow in Rome, marries her, and is left with all of her money when she dies. Now Sulla was truly a patrician. He had the money to back it. With this newfound money, Sulla took on a political career and is eventually elected as quaestor in 107 BC. And then, he joins Gaius Marius on his campaign in Numidia. Now, let's get back to the hunt for King Jugurtha. Jugurtha had invaded these two men for some time, but was slowly being pressed into a corner in the west of Numidia, near the border of the Kingdom of Mauritania. This kingdom was home to King Bocchus, the father-in-law of Jugurtha. So far, he had managed to stay out of the conflict, but as Jugurtha ran out of room in Numidia, it was clear that the problem would come to him no matter what he did. He could either accept Jugurtha or turn him in. To turn father-in-law against son-in-law was a young Roman officer named Sulla. He gained the total friendship of King Bocchus and instructed him to capture Jugurtha if he sought to have a meeting with him. In 106 BC, the opportunity presented itself, and Jugurtha was betrayed and brought to Sulla in chains, who brought him the chains in Marius, who promptly took all the credit, and accidentally caused the start of one of the greatest rivalries in all of human history. Jugurtha would then be brought to Rome at the head of a triumph, and kept in prison until he starved to death in 104 BC. While the Numidian War was still raging on in the south, a new threat appeared in the north, in the form of a migrating Germanic tribe called the Cimbri. In 109 BC, they defeated a Roman army and continued living inside of Roman borders. In 107 BC, Rome is again threatened by the Cimbri tribe, who are joined by the Teutoni tribe in another migration. A consular army, headed by Quintus Servilius Caepio, is defeated in 10 BC, and now, this migration is started to be viewed as a real threat by Rome. Caepio's loss at Arausio, at the hands of these Germanic tribes, is the worst defeat Rome has suffered since Hannibal's masterpiece at Cannae. This threat has so far shrugged off multiple Roman armies that had been sent to deal with them. The Senate needed to pick an experienced commander to expel this threat. Perhaps the best shot that they had was to give Marius another consulship and let him deal with the problem as he did with Jugurtha. The only thing holding him back from this consulship was about 7 years, as the same consul could only be elected one time every 10 years. But Rome was running out of soldiers and desperate for competent militancy. So, for the year of 105 BC, Marius legally wins the consulship and is set to deal with the migrations of the Germanic tribes. The problem now was the amount of available recruitable men was near to nothing, as only Romans who owned a certain amount of land could join the military, and about 80,000 of them laid dead in the fields of Arausio. Combined with the soldiers that Marius had kept stationed in Numidia, there were simply not enough men. So Marius set about to reform the army and the whole political and economic world of the Roman Republic. The Marian reforms initially started in 107 BC, when Gaius Marius, as consul, drops the land requirement to join the military. This was huge. The military was a great job for many poor Romans. After 20 years of service, you could get your own land granted for you, as well as be granted Roman citizenship. This roughly created a new social class that was between the peasant and the middle class. This new warrior class would be just the reserves that Rome needed. There was an easily visible problem with recruiting the poor, however. And well, that was their lack of equipment, as every Roman soldier was given a sword and a shield, but had to pay for the rest of their own armor or weapons. Marius changed this as well, and made sure that the Republic gave all of the needed armor and equipment that a soldier needed. Combined with this reform, Marius also reformed army transportation, which had been a problem especially when chasing the nomadic King Jugurtha. Instead of carting along your supplies, every soldier now carried only what they needed, in a sack, on a stick, slung over the shoulder, and a pickaxe for any possible digging that may take place. The army also got a total revamp in organization and officers, as new formations, namely that of the cohorts and the centuries, and new military rankings started popping up with legates being used. It is important to note that some modern historians believe that the Marian reforms were over-exaggerated, and didn't completely overhaul the organizational aspect of the army. This is possible and should not be overlooked, but either way, Gaius Marius did manage to drastically increase the effectiveness of the legions through his new state-sponsored military. Now it was time to put this army to the test. All that was left to do now was recruit, which sounded easier than it was. And he did not just get 30,000 Roman legionnaires overnight, and it takes a long time to train that many new recruits. So that is what he did for the better part of a year, as he stationed this new army near a town called Aquia Sexti. This town and the subsequent fortress that he had built near it was directly in between the city of Rome and the Cimbri tribe. During this time, the Cimbri moved into lands in northern Iberia, which wasn't a part of Rome at this time. With the threat just over the horizon, Marius returned to Rome for consular elections. Surprisingly, Marius ran, and even more surprisingly, he won. A consular 2 years in a row hasn't happened since Hannibal was in Italy over 100 years ago. Already, with one of the most impressive Roman careers of any living or dead, Marius returns to his newly formed and expertly trained legions. One of the legates that Marius had hired in this army to train them was none other than Lucius Sulla. But still, the clock ticked on, and the Germanic tribes remained on the Iberian Peninsula. Marius knew that the numerous tribes would be kicked out of Iberia and move on to Italy. This is what he told the people of Rome, as Marius ran for a record 3 consulships in a row and a grand total of 4. Many were against it, as it was starting to look less like a republic and more like a dictatorship. But nonetheless, this did not stop the threat of the Cimbri from being ignored. Marius won again in 102 BC, and good thing he did, as the tribes of Germania would invade Italy in that same year. Would the preparation matter against the armies that had killed at least 200,000 Roman soldiers? The tribes would split up and attack Italy. The Teutones and the Ambrones were set to advance from the south and attack Italy along the western coast of the peninsula. The feared Cimbri tribe was supposed to cross the Alps in the north, while an allied Celtic tribe called the Tigrini were to cross the Alps further east from the Cimbri. And if there is anything that gives the Roman Republic PTSD, it's when people start crossing the Alps. Marius was right. They attacked the Italian peninsula. But now, he was to split up his force, as the enemy would have outflanked him if he had not. The other consul for 102 BC was a man by the name of Quintus Latinus Catulus. He would take the rest of the army to the east, and surprisingly, with Marius' longtime cavalry commander Sulla. This is where the competitive portion of the Marius versus Sulla rivalry begins. It's not clear what happened, but the two men had some sort of falling out a few years ago. Sulla then petitioned for Marius to let him join Catulus' army, which he obliged. This was probably a good thing though, as Sulla had far more military experience than Consul Catulus. There was no time for political rivalries, as the Germanic tribes were bottling up the Italian peninsula, with perhaps the most pressing threat being the western invasion of the Ambrones and the Teutones. Marius was heavily outnumbered. Some estimates say that this migratory group consisted of 200,000 to 100,000 people, with the bulk of them being trained warriors. To deny the enemy this clear advantage, General Marius decided not to face them on the open battlefield. Instead, he held firm in the fort near Aquia Sexti that he had trained his legions in. This was perhaps the greatest and most professional Roman army to ever be assembled at this point, but they were still untested, and now hid behind their fort as the Germanic hordes put them under siege. After a few days, it was clear that Marius was going to remain in the fort. This frustrated the Germans, who attempted to attack the fortress. After a day's worth of combat and thousands of dead Germans, the siege was lifted. This was the first victory that his legions needed. The German tribes moved further away from the fort, and Gaius Marius waited for them to be out of eyesight before leaving the protection of his fort. His plan was to stalk the Teutones and Ambrones and wait for the perfect time to strike in an ambush. He went about this, but instead of choosing when he would give the tribes battle, they would both find one another. On complete accident. The legions of Marius had been expertly trained and disciplined, but apparently someone forgot to train the army servants in a similar manner. The Ambrones tribe, for whatever reason, also decided to camp far away from their much larger Teutone ally. The camp servants were tasked to gather water from a nearby stream, but quickly started running back to the Roman camp in fear. They had run into some Ambrones who had chased them away. This prompted the closest Roman auxiliary force to gather their armor and weapons to give them battle. Then more Romans joined the battle, and then more Ambrones joined the battle, until most of their warriors joined in the unexpected battle. The legions were able to find organization and march behind the position of the Roman auxiliary. With a signal, the auxiliary retreated behind the heavily armored legionnaires and gave them plenty of room to throw their pilum and charge at the Ambrones. The Ambrones would break and rout, and Rome had finally managed to defeat one of the Germanic tribes. The remaining Ambrones ran to the Teutone camp, where they told their king, King Teutobod, about their defeat. This enraged the king, who assembled his fellow tribesmen and planned to attack and avenge his Ambroni brothers. As many as 100,000 angry Germans were now destined to clash with the 37,000 of Marius. The next day, Marius took a defensive position at the top of a hill and waited for his enemies to attack him. Seeing no other way but up, the Teutones and the remainder of the Ambrones attacked up the hill. The horde of men pushed at the Romans, and for a moment, it looked like this force might envelop them, until one of the Roman officers smashed into the Germanic flank with 3,000 men and nearly surrounded them. The battle turned into a rout, and soon the tribes were running down the hill that they had just fought for. It's said that some 70,000 to 100,000 Germans were killed or enslaved in this battle, called the Battle of Aquae Sexti. King Teutobod, along with a few thousand men, retreated to the north and as far away from Marius as possible. Unfortunately for King Teutobod, he would be captured by a Gallic tribe that would detain him and hand him over to Gaius Marius. That's now 2 Germanic tribes dealt with, and the western invasion of Italy halted. But there was still the feared Cimbri to deal with, and they had just crossed the Alps and nearly decimated the army given to Consul Catulus. They were now in Italy proper, and when the 101 BC election showed up, the scared Roman senators quickly selected none other than Gaius Marius to be their consul for the 4th year in a row. Desperate times always call for desperate measures. And parties, apparently, because when Marius returned to Rome, he was granted a triumph, despite the Cimbri raiding the nearby countryside. So, after this quick party, Marius and his fellow consul, Catulus, would combine their armies. The Cimbri were presently in the Po Valley, and before the inevitable battle, the two sides met. King Boirox of the Cimbri and Gaius Marius were finally face to face, and Boirox was quick to mention his fellow Teutonic tribe, and how screwed the Romans were when they got here. After Boirox says this, Marius then proceeds to show the king his new prisoner, King Teutobod. Angrily, Boirox ended the meeting and went back to camp. I can definitely see the Romans having a good laugh at this once Boirox was out of earshot. The Battle of Versilia, also known as the Battle of the Rhodine Plain for which it took place on, would see the 53,000 legionaries and auxiliary of Marius and Catulus, and because Catulus recombined his army with Marius, this meant the skilled cavalry commander Lucius Sulla was back on the same team as his rival Marius. The two would put their differences aside, as Rome needed both of their military expertise for the 150,000 Cimbri warriors that sat just north of their capital. The morning of July 30th of 101 BC would see the Roman army and Cimbri march onto the Rhodine Plain. Only one of them would return. Marius, with the larger of the two consular armies, decided to split his men into groups of 15,000 and place them on the flanks, while Catulus's remaining army of 23,000 formed the middle. Marius would stay on the left flank and command his men there, while Catulus controlled his central soldiers, and Sulla would be positioned on the far right with his cavalry that had helped to win so many battles at this point. The horde of Germanic soldiers approached the Roman lines and waited for any kind of attack. The Romans were ordered to hold position and stay on the defensive, while the Cimbri eventually got tired of waiting. But by that time, the morning sun had shifted into an afternoon sun, and the Cimbri men watched as 53,000 Roman helmets reflected the sunlight. This, if the sources are to be believed, frightened the Cimbri warriors. The Romans apparently noticed this fear and were suddenly ordered to go on the offensive. Marius' left flank marched forward and prepared for battle. Marius apparently sensed a weakness in the enemy's right flank and moved his soldiers to exploit it. There is one problem with this plan, however, as Marius did not account for the massive dust cloud he was walking into. When he emerged from the other side of the cloud, he wasn't even near where the battle was. Yep, that's right. The 5-time consul, war hero, military reforming general got beat by a dust cloud. This left poor, useless Catulus wide open for a head-on cavalry charge that was led up by an infantry charge by a Cimbri wedge formation. But as the Cimbri cavalry moved out of the way for their infantry to charge, a few small contingents of Romans were lured out by the moving cavalry and began to chase them. After moving further away from the battle, the Cimbri charged at these exposed Romans, only for them to become the exposed ones as Sulla's elite cavalry crashed into that of the Cimbris. Sulla had completely outflanked and surprised them, and now they cut through them. Eventually they routed directly into their own infantry and caused them to panic. Then, it was all just a matter of killing and capturing 150,000 warriors and their families. And then Marius showed up. Once again, Sulla had gained Marius a victory without Marius being there. And once again, Marius would attempt to take all of that credit. Seeing as he wasn't even at the battle, Catulus rejected this, and the two would argue for some time until they agreed to share the triumph. But Marius would be made the third founder of Rome along with Romulus and Marcus Camillus, another military politician. If Marius would have died right here, he would have been considered one of the greatest Roman heroes of all time. But he falls just short of this, because Marius stuck around for another 15 years. Marius would win his sixth consulship out of respect in the year of 100 BC. Some say that Marius feared that he would not win, so he bribed voters to ensure his consulship that he shared with Lucius Valerius Flaccus. But everyone surely knew who was really in charge. One of the many power-hungry politicians that decided to further their career by siding with Marius was Lucius Appius Saturninus. He was elected to be a tribune of the plebes in 100 BC, and immediately set about creating laws that were obviously in favor of Marius and his soldiers, such as the land law that would distribute land to the armies of Marius that had fought off the Germanic tribes just 1 year ago. The problem with Saturninus and his laws is that it granted not only the property, but also Roman citizenship to all who participated in the Cimbri War, even the Italian soldiers who grew up far away from the city of Rome. This was a big deal, as the citizenship had been closely guarded by the conservative patrician and senatorial classes so that they can retain their powerful status. But the senators would all be forced to oblige with these laws. Well, except for one. Another bill was put forward that would exile any member of the Senate who attempted to overturn these laws. The one senator who remained staunchly opposed to both of these laws was a former consul and general in the Jugurthine War, Marius's old rival, Metellus Numidicus. For Marius, these proposed bills helped him in a multitude of ways, but the influence of Saturninus could not be ignored. He was, for all intents and purposes, a demagogue. A demagogue is someone that gives empty promises that sound amazing on paper in order to win political power. Saturninus became a demagogue when he promised the poor citizen class a huge boost to the grain dole, which rallied the people of Rome. This law was nearly identical to the one that Tiberius Gracchus tried to pass a few years ago, and he got murdered in the streets by senators, so let's see how this goes. The people's support only went so far, however, as an ally of Saturninus named Glaucia ran for the office of praetor for the 99 BC elections. Glaucia had already been praetor during the year 100, but it was clear that he would not repeat this success, as a man named Gaius Memmichus had returned to Rome after a successful governorship of Macedon. Memmichus was favored to win the 99 BC election, but Saturninus and Glaucia had one more trick up their sleeves to prevent this. Yep, they were going to order for his assassination, but they do it in quite possibly the dumbest way. During the vote, a group of thugs hired by Saturninus ransacked the ballots and eventually found Gaius Memmichus. Then they proceed to bludgeon him to death. Now this was one of the most obvious political assassinations in history. It was done in plain sight and during a vote where Glaucia was the only competition. The Senate was called, and they all agreed to delay the voting until the blatant corruption and political assassination was dealt with. For this, the Senate issued an arrest for Glaucia and Saturninus, and gave Marius the go-ahead to use whatever kind of force was needed to deal with them. But there is a slight problem. There is a small mob forming in Rome, made even worse by a gathering of Italian citizens that were promised equal status as Romans if they sided with Saturninus. So Marius gathers guardsmen and is joined by senators to take the two men prisoner. Men loyal to Saturninus and Glaucia fortified the Capitol Hill, and more specifically the Temple Jupiter. Troops commanded by Marius then cut off the aqueduct to the hill. He promised to lawfully handle the besieged men if they all surrendered. Saturninus and Glaucia accepted these terms and surrendered peacefully. Then a bunch of wealthy citizens climbed on the roof of the building, tore the terracotta roof off, and started hucking bricks at the two men. The old Roman sport of senatorial death dodge brick. The late Roman Republic, you are just a strange place. Saturninus ended up getting stone roof shingled to death, along with a few of his supporters. But earlier in the day, Glaucia had slipped away from Marius and the mob, and was hiding at a friend's house. He was then found, dragged onto the street, and slain. In a scene mimicking that of Tiberius Gracchus, the order of the Roman Senate had been restored. But had it? Marius was on his 5th consulship in a row, and had just killed other Romans in the city of Rome. He proved his use in organizing the armies of Rome in their times of need. But now internal and external threats had all seemingly been eradicated by Marius. In the 99 BC election, Marius was not re-elected consul. It had just been too long for a republican system of government to run like this. With the people and the Senate both tired of him, the 57-year-old Marius was forced into retirement. First going to Greece, and then moving into the Anatolian Peninsula by 98 BC. It is rumored that while he is in Anatolia, he meets with the King of Poison, Mithridates VI of Pontus, called the Poison King due to the tolerance that he had built up to poison by microdosing on it for decades. He controlled one of the largest kingdoms in the area, Pontus, and was allied to Tigranes the Great of Armenia, a country on the brink of reaching its largest territorial expanse. Apparently, when Marius was talking to the king, he warned him to start building up his own army against the murder machines that he had just created in Rome. Like I said before, this is just a rumor, and we don't even know if he actually met with Mithridates of Pontus. Marius would return from his vacation, or self-imposed exile, in 97 BC, where he promptly joins the candidacy for that year's consular elections. He basically gets laughed off stage, though. The senators try to appease Marius by making him an absentia in that same year. An absentia was literally a bird watcher. They would interpret the will of the gods by watching birds and how they fly. Although they did command a great deal of honor in the Roman world, it's certainly no consulship, but it's something. By 96 BC, though, Marius held no political office, but Lucius Sulla did. He had just gained the office of governor of Cilicia, a province in eastern Anatolia on the southern coast of the peninsula. Here he was on pirate duty, hunting down the Cilician pirates around the island of Cyprus and the coastal mountains of Cilicia. After being granted the governorship, he is ordered to put a king of Cappadocia back on his throne. His name was Ariobanzes. The throne of Cappadocia had changed a few years ago when Mithridates of Pontus put his son on the throne of Cappadocia. With an undersupplied force of Romans, Sulla managed to put Ariobanzes on his throne in under a year. By 95 BC, the king, and now Roman ally in Cappadocia, was Ariobanzes. On this very campaign is when a Roman diplomat would meet with a Parthian one for the very first time. The rivalry held between these two nations would far transcend that of Marius or Sulla, and right up until Parthia is conquered by the Sassanid dynasty centuries later. In this meeting, Sulla showed the Parthians the old Roman tradition of being a pompous twat with a superiority complex, as he made it clear from the beginning that Parthia was equal to Cappadocia, which, might I remind you, is subordinate to Rome. In 94 BC, Sulla would have another numerically superior army to beat, in the form of King Tigranes the Great of Armenia. He impressively, and quite easily, manages to defeat this army and leaves to return to Rome in 93 BC. Sulla, with his many military victories, was preparing to run for another public office. But these hopes were dashed when charges of extortion against Ariobanzes were brought up against Sulla. The trial against him was then prepped, with the accusing party failing to even show up. The charges alone were enough to drop his prestige to the point where he didn't even run for a public office. While Sulla had been gaining more military victories, Marius was trying to regain the trust of the people. A conflict had been growing on the Italian peninsula between those considered Romans and those considered Italians, or as the Romans would call them, Soci, which translates to ally. Marius emboldens the flames of this growing animosity when he chooses to lawyer up and defend an Italian man named Matrinus, who was put on trial in 95 BC. A new law, supported by that year's consuls, Quintus Scavalio and Lucius Crassus, a relative of the 20-year-old Marcus Licinius Crassus, who would later become famous for being the richest man in Rome, despite this family coming from a plebeian background. The law that the two had passed was very inconspicuous and unspecific, and directly targeted Italians who had been granted citizenship. Matrinus was one of these men. Marius won the case for him and saved his life, but fanned the flames for reform. At this point, political factions known as the Populares and Optimates were forming. Populare refers to winning over the people, while the Optimate refers to those who support the elites, like those in the Senate. The Populare, with help from Marius, started to form an easy alliance with the Italian peoples. The issue only grew in the next few years, until it exploded. In 91 BC, Rome entered another war, but not against some faraway king or migrating tribe. No, this was a civil war, called the Social War. This conflict saw the Roman allies in Italy revolt, due to them being used increasingly more in the military, but still being shunned for their citizenship. The issues at hand just needed a spark to ignite them. When a plebeian tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus was assassinated, when he tried to pass a bill through the Senate that would allow for the citizenship to be extended further into those in the Italian peninsula. Italian revolt broke out in the north of Italy and in southern Italy, centered around the town of Samoninum. Sulla served as a legate in the army of Lucius Julius Caesar, grandfather of Mark Antony. Even Marius was told to rejoin the army and serve as a legate, where he would offer his militaristic wisdom to his nephew, who was now consul in 91 BC. His name was Publius Rutilius Lupus, and he seemed not to have listened to Marius very well. Marius, being a master trainer of troops, advised his nephew to drill his soldiers for some time before engaging with the Italian allies. Lupus did not heed this advice and quickly marched to meet the enemy. But this was unlike any enemy that Rome had ever faced before. Highly organized, disciplined, and silent, just like them. In fact, it was them. There was really no way to tell a Roman apart from an Italian. The only thing that separated Lupus from these rebels was the Tolenus River. To cross the river, Lupus split his army in half and gave command of the other half of his army to Gaius Marius. The plan was to build 2 separate bridges across the river, then fight their way through the Italians. After a few days, the bridges were built, and the 2 forces marched to cross the bridges. The enemy had placed a small amount of soldiers on Marius' side, just enough to keep him busy, while the main portion of the army stood firm and ready to fight Lupus. Lupus fell into this trap, and was eventually killed in the combat. It was rumored that his body floated down the river and just past Marius. Marius managed to defeat the few soldiers that he was to contend with, but when there was no sign of his nephew Lupus, he books it to the bridge where he finds the Italians looting the bodies of the dead Romans. Marius then gives battle and avenges his nephew by defeating them. The body of Lupus is later found and mournfully returned to Rome by Marius. For Sulla, this conflict was somewhat boring, as he had the role of maintaining a defensive flank for Lucius Julius Caesar. Was his job important? Yes. But was he very overqualified for it? Yes. Sulla may have been stuck in this boring role if it wasn't for his old commander, Gaius Marius, who proposed a plan to trap the rebel armies in a pincer formation between the 2 men. Sulla marched north, while Marius looked for ways to trap the Italians. With Sulla close, he pressed for battle and sent the enemy running. They didn't get very far and ran straight into Sulla, who slaughtered them. This is the last time Marius and Sulla would ever be on the same side in a military action. Sulla then joined the siege of Acerina in southern Italy with Lucius Julius Caesar. With Lupus dead, Marius was assigned a new commander, Quintus Servilius Caepio the Younger, son of the man who had been defeated so severely by the Cimbri at Arausio. The 2 commanders immediately butted heads. Caepio wanted to fight, but Marius disobeyed orders, as he did not think it was a good time to attack. Caepio continued the offensive anyways. Then, his army was massacred and he was killed. When 89 BC rolled around, Marius was relieved of his command and replaced by that year's consul. He had won notoriety and helped to inadvertently win the Populari Party more members. In 90 BC, Consul Lucius Julius Caesar becomes the first of the many Julii to create a law in Rome. His proposal was to grant any Italian not already in revolt citizenship. This stopped the momentum of the civil war, but the ones in revolt fought on until 87 BC, but were largely contained. While the closing days of the social war was ending, another war had just started far away in the east. 2 Roman allied kingdoms called Nicomedia and Bithynia invaded Pontus. King Mithridates VI responded by invading those kingdoms, which was already against Roman law, as they were allied kingdoms. Mithridates made the situation even worse, though, by invading the Roman land on the borders of those kingdoms. This meant that war was necessary. Now the upcoming consulship would be guaranteed to go to an experienced general. And who was better positioned than Sulla, who had just participated in the whole of the social war up until that point? Well, the only person better positioned than him was the 6-time consul Gaius Marius. Sulla would win this election and the military honor to campaign against Mithridates of Pontus. This angered the 68-year-old Marius, who wanted his precious consulship and military command of the Mithridatic War so bad that he couped the Roman Republic once Sulla left with his own army. Marius overthrew the Republic, forced the command of the war over to him through the Senate. Usually this would be listened to, but Sulla's army was still loyal to him. He then turned around and became the first Roman general ever to march on Rome itself. If the last civil war was called the Social Wars, then this one might as well have been called the next civil war with an unfitting name, as it is called Sulla's Civil War. Sulla just seemed to be restoring order internally, so he could protect the eastern border from Pontus. Regardless, Sulla's civil war would see a march back to Rome from south-central Italy. Marius expected his longtime subordinate Sulla to hand over his army to him, but when he refused, Gaius Marius freaked out. This was the guy who had been a decisive factor in Marius's victorious battles multiple times, and had decades of military experience. Marius, in the midst of his panic, decides to grant freedom to all gladiators and slaves that help him fight against Sulla. Still, his army was small, but he prepared to battle his former legate, who marched into Rome after a short siege. The two most respected men of their time would face each other in battle. Of course, it was easily won by Sulla, who then recalled the Senate to reinstate his right to command the soldiers in the Mithridatic War. He also forced the Senate to exile Gaius Marius, his son, Gaius Marius the Younger, and 10 other of their supporters to the Roman province of Africa. By the time order in Rome was restored, it was time for a new consular election for 87 BC. Gnaeus Octavius, who was a longtime supporter of Sulla, was chosen for one spot. For the other was a supporter of Gaius Marius named Lucius Cornelius Cinna, a far-out relative to Lucius Cornelius Sulla. With Rome politically balanced in Sulla's favor, he marched out and continued on his original course. His first stop would be the city of Athens. Mithridates VI of Pontus had installed a puppet tyrant in the city who was loyal to him, since he started his war against Rome. After his siege and blockade of the Athenian port, the tyrant had neglected a part of his wall. Sulla used miners to dig under the wall and destroy its integrity. After some time, a large section of the wall came down, and Athens would, for lack of a better word, be brutally sacked and partially burned, with the port receiving the worst of the fire damage. The tyrant of Athens then flees to the Acropolis and poisons himself on the altar of Athena. How ominous is that? At around the same time that this siege was going on, Rome did what it had been doing recently politically, by exploding with regards to who should be considered a citizen and who is not. Consul Cinna was a supporter of citizen rights, being dispensed outwards, and even proposed 31 different voting districts in the Italian peninsula. This was met by anger by the Optimate Senate, who did not want another Gracchus or Saturninus, so they ordered the other consul to kick Cinna out of Rome. There is nothing known of Cinna's life or origins until his consulship, but his next actions would secure him a spot as the second Roman to ever march on Rome. With his popularity and Italian supporters, Cinna quickly manages to raise 10 legions. One of his legates was an experienced commander in the social wars, named Quintus Sertorius, who will become very important later. Ironically, Sertorius was now fighting alongside the Italians that he had once been ordered to kill. All the while, the exiled Gaius Marius had been hard at work in Africa. Due to the Jugurthine campaign some 40 years ago, the province of Africa supported Marius, who recruited these men into his newly formed army. Hearing news of the pro-Marius Cinna and his revolution, Marius left his exile after only a year to return to Rome. He then combined his army with that of Cinna, and for once, was happy to relinquish overall command to the consul. The combined army reached Rome, and the largely undefended city opened the gates to the two armies. Sulla's siege of Rome was largely a peaceful affair after the initial combat concluded. But the same could not be said of this siege. Cinna's army kept their promise to the Senate, and left Rome untouched, while the soldiers under Marius, who did not agree to this, ransacked and looted Rome, hunting down pro-Sulla Optimate supporters and generally causing havoc. Marius, who had once been the savior of Rome, just destroyed the very city that he had always claimed to protect. Cinna was now the sole decision-making consul, as Gnaeus Octavius was forced to flee the city. He pushed a law through the Senate that would declare Sulla as an enemy of Rome, despite his waging of a successful war in the east. Cinna would also only allow for 2 men to be named as consul for 86 BC. These 2 men, who would obviously win the vote, were himself, for the second year in a row, and the other was the now 7-time consul Gaius Marius. Then 17 days later, the 71-year-old statesman died of a stroke, putting an end to the republic-destroying life of one of Rome's most notorious men. The actions of Marius over the last 2 years of his life showed a growing sense of paranoia. He proclaimed to be the head of the common people, but wasn't afraid to overthrow a republic to do it. Now the Populares and pro-Marius faction were left leaderless. This power vacuum would be partially inherited by Gaius Marius the Younger, who had a small following, but the main inheritor of Marius' legacy was the now lone consul Cinna. Through him, the rivalry of Marius versus Sulla was continued when Cinna decided to take his army that he had just pacified Rome with, and use it to force Sulla into submission. Sulla by this time was still in Athens and probably didn't even know Cinna was in Greece before he was already dead. His army had mutinied against him, and when Cinna surrendered to them, offering his personal jewelry if they would let him live, they killed him on the spot and returned to Italy. Hilariously, Sulla won this civil war without even raising a finger. And good thing, because Sulla had one more army in Greece to deal with. When Athens sided with Pontus, King Mithridates sent his best general to conquer the rest of Greece. His name was Archelaus, and with him were 60,000 Pontic infantry and cavalry that included 90 scythed chariots. Sulla met them in the valley between the mountains that the town of Chaeronea rested in. There's a certain stereotype about Roman armies that the majority of these armies were made up mostly of infantry. Sulla's army at this point was one of the exceptions to this otherwise mostly true stereotype. While the majority of his 30,000 army was infantry, there was still a sizable 7,000 cavalry under his command. Sulla was and always had been a good cavalry commander, and now he had the army composition to match that skill. They would be the first Roman unit in this engagement to attack, but not the first unit to attack Pontus. The men from the town of Chaeronea found an easy ally in Rome. Sulla tasked these men with dislodging the Pontic soldiers from his mountainous left flank. With 3,000 men, these Chaeroneans surprise and rout the Pontic men. They easily dislodged them and sent them running in the plain in between the mountains and on the opposite sides, in between the two armies about to battle. The Roman cavalry on the left side was then able to mop up these stragglers. The Pontic army sees that Sulla is now pressing for battle and sends in their scythed chariots, but Sulla ordered his organized legions to simply walk out of their way so that the chariots could pass through their lines. This trapped the chariots in the middle of the Roman army and allowed for all 90 of them to be struck down by Roman pilum. After this, Sulla ordered for a general advance and for pilum to be thrown at the lightly armored and shieldless Pontic soldiers. Then the bulk of the Roman infantry was ordered forward to march toward the soldiers, a large portion of which were forcefully conscripted slaves. The trained Roman infantry then beat their Pontic counterparts within minutes. The Pontic army then fled back to Anatolia, where Mithridates would begin to raise a new army. Another new army had been built in Rome as well. It was under the command of General Flaccus, and he was sent to capture both Sulla and Mithridates. Sulla was just about to confront this army when the Pontic army had returned. They landed on the island of Eurobia and made camp on the beach. Sulla constructed his camp nearby, digging ditches and other defensive works to firmly entrench their position against the 80,000 Pontic soldiers and 90 more scythed chariots. On the day of the Battle of Orchomenus, the Pontic army, as always, started off with the charge of their terrifying, yet completely ineffective, scythed chariots. These horse-drawn buggies found pits filled with spikes, and the ones that could run back to the army did, causing disarray and lowering already low morale. Still, the Pontic general pushed the offensive and attacked the trench works that held the Roman army. Sulla quickly routed these men and pushed their invaders all the way back to the sea. The Pontic general and a few thousand men escaped, but Sulla had just easily defeated two Pontic armies that outnumbered him 3-1 or even slightly more. The only thing that could stop Sulla now was another Roman army. But luckily, Lucius Valerius Flaccus ignored his order to capture Sulla and ran past him and into Anatolia. His army would eventually mutiny against him and murder him, but the newly led army pushed on and almost did capture Mithridates, and they would have, if the Roman navy wasn't only cooperating with Sulla at this point. Mithridates had been sent on the run, and with no real hopes of winning anymore, he met with Sulla to discuss the terms of peace. Mithridates would be forced to give all of the Rome and Roman allied lands back to their rightful owners. He would also have to pay a large war indemnity, supply Rome with some of his ships, and also supply Rome with 500 Pontic archers. With the outside threat of Mithridates gone, Sulla had only to worry about the state of Rome itself, who still considered him as public enemy number one. Marching back to Rome, there was no way of knowing what Sulla might do to the Republican government if he again successfully marched on the city. 83 BC, 5 years after his only consulship, Sulla would return to Italy. He landed in the south of Italy, between the heel and the toe of the boot, and marched straight for Rome. In 82 BC, the decisive battle of this war would take place just outside of Rome, at a place called the Colline Gate. This would be, for the time being, the deciding battle in the long conflict of the Populares versus Sulla's Optimates. The battle was a grinding long one, and indecisive until Sulla's left wing, which he personally commanded, started to be pushed backwards. It was at this crucial moment that a young and wealthy noble who commanded the right flank stepped forward. Marcus Licinius Crassus pushed back and routed the Populari army on the right side. This was the only real military success that this soon-to-be richest man in Rome would ever achieve. But it was enough for Sulla's left flank to push themselves forward and fight on. The Populari army would then break and run away from the battle. Sulla now had the strings of Rome tied around his fist, and he intended to tie this knot even tighter, as he soon declared himself in 82 BC to be dictator for life. At this point, the Roman Republic now appeared to be dead, as one person held all of the power. Well, he would have had all the power of the Republic if the pro-Marius faction didn't remain in Spain. Remember how I said that Quintus Sertorius would become important later? Well, he would become the military figurehead of this outcast faction and wage a guerrilla war against Sulla and Rome for the next decade until his murder in 73 BC. Sulla then set about throwing away most of the Populari reforms that had been made over the past 60 years. He basically neutered the office of plebeian tribune, creating a law that stipulated if you were to run as plebeian tribune and win, that you could never run for a political office in Rome ever again. He also made quick work of his political enemies by posting their names on a bounty list, with the result being thousands of dead Roman nobles. One of the names that would pop up on this list was Gaius Julius Caesar, although he would never be tried or executed for any of his crimes. This would leave disdain for the Populari faction in Caesar for the rest of his life. Sulla then stacked the Senate from 300 members to 600 members, surely putting his own friends and supporters in these new government seats. Then Sulla expanded the limits of the ever-growing city of Rome, greeting new Roman citizens under the fold. And then he gave everyone in the Italian peninsula citizenship, what they had all been looking for. Then only 2 years later, Sulla gave up his dictatorial power and handed back the reins of government to the Roman Republic. Then the 58-year-old Lucius Cornelius Sulla retired to his villa in southern Italy. Here he would live the remainder of his life with his family, while he drank and partied until his death in 78 BC at the age of just 60. His stone epitaph on his grave reads, "Never was there a friend who served me, nor an enemy who wronged me, that I did not repay in full." Sounds like a tyrant, if you ask me. But both Marius and Sulla were tyrants, as they chipped away at the rules and regulations of the Roman Republic for their own selfish glory. At the end of both of their days, the Republic would be restored. But at what cost? As the Roman Republic would only live on for a few more decades. Yes, these two rivals truly paved the way for the rise of Julius Caesar, Octavian, Augustus, and finally the death of the Republic and the birth of an empire.